Greetings and a warm welcome to episode 17 of the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. This week, there were 13 mentions of Australia in the Global Times, and in contrast, there were 5 mentions of China in Sky News Australia. Let's go through the headlines. Published on the 8th of March, Morrison tries to leverage Australia's influence in Indo-Pacific region with Cold War-style rhetoric. Published on the 8th of March, Aussie researcher warns of deadly risk of novel flu viruses. Published on the 8th of March, tough 24 hours ahead as rains drench Sydney, forcing snap evacuations. The next headline reads, Australian Commerce Body calls for re-engagement with China to achieve win-win economic results. Published on the 9th of March, Forces Behind Fiction. The next headline reads, India-Australia FTA talks shouldn't be led by anti-China paranoia. The next headline reads, a submissive Australia in no position to criticize India's independent strategies on Ukraine crisis. The next headline reads, PM to declare national emergency. Published on the 9th of March, deadly floods continue to batter Australia's east. On the 10th of March, this next headline reads, Australia's military buildup controlled by US. Risks nuclear contamination. Published on the 10th of March, Greeting the Child. On the 10th of March as well, Enlightened Festival runs in Canberra, Australia. And the final article for the week from the Global Times, published on the 11th of March, New Zealand tourism recovery faces great challenges amid phased border reopening. That's the quick scan of the headlines from the Global Times. 13 mentions of Australia in all for the week running from Monday the 7th of March to Sunday the 13th of March. Switching over to Sky News Australia. The first headline reads, no country will have a bigger impact on ending Russia-Ukraine war than China. PM demands China denounce Russia or risk further bloodshed. Australia's richest person calls for desperate boost to military funding. China's chilling warning to West over Russia's war on Ukraine. And that's the overview of the headlines coming in from Sky News Australia. Let's move on to unpack each of these articles. The first article we're looking at was published on the 8th of March in the Global Times. It appeared in the opinion/viewpoint section by Xu Shanpin. With the headline, Morrison tries to leverage Australia's influence in Indo-Pacific region with Cold War-style rhetoric. The opening paragraph reads, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison on Monday virtually addressed the Australia-based Lowy Institute, exploiting the recent military conflicts between Russia and Ukraine. He once again made some absurd warnings. Morrison warned that a new arc of autocracy is forming to reshape the world. We face the specter of a transactional world devoid of principle, accountability and transparency, where state sovereignty, territorial integrity and liberty are surrendered for respite from coercion and intimidation, or economic entrapment dressed up as economic reward, he said, Australia faces its most difficult and dangerous security environment in 80 years. Although Morrison is accustomed to uttering nonsense, his expression and wording this time is surprising. The West uses terms like arc of instability and arc of terrorism, but the arc of autocracy seems to have been used for the first time. Such rhetoric means that Morrison wants to increase US's antagonism between autocracy and democracy, hoping that values-based diplomacy will solidify the Western liberal democratic camp against China and Russia. This is a Cold War style speech. Morrison's lines sound like an Iron Curtain speech. Recently, Australia has been showing off, with its senior politicians repeatedly spouting headline-grabbing rhetoric. Amid the Ukraine crisis, Canberra is worried that the West, especially Washington, will put its strategic emphasis on NATO and reduce strategic investment in the Indo-Pacific region. Therefore, Australia is constantly underlining the threat from China in a bid to draw the US's attention to the Indo-Pacific region. Morrison's address on Monday is no exception, during which he mentioned China several times. Australia has long supported the status quo that has underpinned regional security and prosperity. That status quo is disturbed by China's military actions. There's no doubt that China has become more assertive and is using its powers in ways that are causing concern to nations across the region and beyond. The US ability cannot match its ambition to deal with Russia and China at the same time. It needs help from its closest allies such as Australia and Japan. Australia particularly wants to stand out and play the role of an acting sheriff in the potential absence of the US in the Indo-Pacific region in order to shape or even dominate the regional pattern and security order. This is because Australia inherited the strategic culture of the British Empire and has always wanted to establish a sub-empire in the region. Once its Commonwealth was formed, Australia established its own colonies and mandated territory nearby, which can be interpreted as establishing a sub-empire. After the withdrawal of the British Empire, Australia inherited this strategic culture and tradition. Australia is mentioned a total of 21 times in this article. And based on what I've read so far, it looks like this article is pointing out how Australia's PM is exaggerating the perception of the China threat and using the specter of the arc of autocracy to support his announcement of the building of a nuclear submarine base. We'll take a closer look at the concluding paragraphs. They read, Morrison also hopes that promoting the China threat can intimidate China's neighboring countries. He will call on these countries to be on guard against China, an autocratic and powerful country. He hopes that these countries will rally around the US and Australia in various small multilateral circles. This will help build the Indo-Pacific framework in favor of Australia. I must say, this is the first time I'm reading something of this nature from the Global Times, trying to build this idea that Australia has inherited a strategic culture which is reminiscent of the British Empire, and Australia's intention always wanted to establish a sub-empire in the region. That's a first. We'll move along to the next article. But before that, I think it's pretty clear from this initial impression that Australia is represented and constructed in a negative light with a line, very clear line, drawn in the sand, with the Aussie PM's exaggeration of the China threat as the main theme. The author is an adjunct researcher at the Centre for Australian Studies, China University of Mining and technology. We'll move along to the next article. This was originally published by Xinhua, March the 8th, 2022 at 6:04 p.m. Found in the World Asia-Pacific section with the headline, Aussie researcher warns of deadly risk of novel flu viruses. The article is accompanied with a photograph with the following captions. Passengers make their way out upon arrival at the Sydney International Airport on February 21st, 2022, as Australia reopened its borders for fully vaccinated visa holders, tourists, and business travelers. The opening paragraphs. The reopening of Australia's international borders following a 2-year closure due to COVID-19 could trigger the rise of new forms of influenza, according to a leading virologist. Professor Kanta Subbarao, writing in the Medical Journal of Australia, the MJA, on Monday, said the lifting of quarantine regulations posed the potential for novel flu viruses, such as from animals, crossing over to humans and then spreading quickly due to the community's lack of immunity. Australia is mentioned 5 times in the article. We'll take a closer look at the concluding paragraphs. So such efforts will be beneficial beyond influenza, the COVID-19 pandemic, and recent reports of a new genotype of Hendra virus in Australian flying foxes are excellent reminders that other viruses, animal viruses that can spread across species, bear watching. Her warning of the flu, novel flu viruses come at a time when health authorities are preparing for the return of seasonal flu following a 2-year reprieve from the usual annual disease. Based on this impression, I think Australia is represented and constructed in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next piece. Originally from Reuters, published March the 8th, 2022 at 5:18 p.m. is the following headline. Tough 24 hours ahead as rains drench Sydney, forcing snap evacuations. The article is accompanied with a photograph with the captions, an aerial view of the flooded city of Maryborough, Australia, along the overflowing Mary River on February 28th, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, flood warnings stretched across Australia's east coast on Tuesday, and tens of thousands of Sydney residents fled their homes as torrential rains again pummeled the country's largest city, flooding several large suburbs. Australia's eastern rivers were already near capacity, following record downpours in several parts of Queensland and New South Wales states over recent weeks, cutting off towns and sweeping away farms, livestock, and roads. A 67-year-old woman and her 30-year-old son were found dead on Tuesday near an abandoned car in a stormwater canal in Western Sydney. Australia was mentioned 3 times in the article, and based on this initial impression, having a closer look at the concluding paragraph, amid flash flooding warnings, authorities asked Sydney's 5 million residents to avoid unnecessary travel on roads and allow plenty of extra time for travel on public transport. I think this is an article that's constructing Australia in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next article. Also published on the 8th of March from the Global Times. In the source/economy section, the headline reads, Australian Commerce Body calls for re-engagement with China to achieve win-win economic results. It's accompanied with a photograph with the following captions. Australian firm Champion Wool Factory presents its wool products during the China International Consumer Products Expo in Haikou, capital of South China's Hainan province, on May the 8th, 2021. The opening paragraph reads, China and Australia could re-engage constructively to achieve win-win outcomes via developing mutually beneficial cooperation despite fraught bilateral relations over the past few years. And Australian businesses hold high expectations for opportunities emerging in the world's second largest economy, the China-Australia Chamber of Commerce, AustCham China, told the Global Times recently. The two sessions, namely the annual sessions of the National People's Congress, the top legislature, and the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the top political advisory body, are a window to observe China's social and economic development priorities for the year and beyond. AustCham members are interested to get to know the key content of the Chinese government's plans for the next 12 months. The government has pledged to shore up stability of its economy and its financial market, while it has made significant progress in important areas such as sustainability, low carbon technologies, common prosperity, and rural development. Australia is mentioned a total of 17 times in the article. And the article goes on to state the importance of such recovering bilateral ties, and the paragraph reads, he emphasized the importance of recovering bilateral economic ties via mutually beneficial cooperation. Considering the growing complexity and global uncertainty, now more than ever, Australia needs to strengthen its relationships with countries across the Asia-Pacific region, Coyle noted. Australian companies are enthusiastic about trade and investment opportunities offered by the RCEP deal and the growth prospects of China and East Asia as a whole. Trade between China and Australia stood at $231.2 billion in 2021, accounting for 3.82% of China's total trade, which surpassed $6 trillion mark for the first time, according to statistics released by China's General Administration of Customs, the GAC. Total imports from Australia stood at $11.4 billion in December 2021, down 13% from $13.07 billion in November. But the imports from Australia for the whole year reached $164.8 billion, up 40% on a yearly basis. Analysts said the increase in the value of China's imports from Australia was mainly due to the skyrocketing prices of goods, especially bulk commodities, and the low base of comparison from 2020. In 2020, China imported $114.8 billion of goods from Australia, down by 5.3% from 2019 per GAC data. Based on this impression, I think Australia is constructed in a somewhat positive toward a positive manner. We'll move along to the next article. Found in the in-depth section of the Global Times, written by the GT staff reporters, published March the 9th, 2022 at 9:27 p.m. The headline reads, GT investigates US politicians, Western media, Taiwan online trolls co-orchestrated disinformation campaign against Chinese mainland and Russia-Ukraine conflict. The forces behind fiction. The opening paragraph of the article reads, false claims targeting China have seen a new wave of proliferation after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as the Global Times discovers that the usual suspects in the disinformation war, senior US officials, Western media outlets, internet trolls from the island of Taiwan, have ganged up to campaign against and scapegoat China. This disinformation campaign relies on anonymous information sources or conjecture to derive pre-assumed conclusions from Western countries led by the US. The Western media then develop them as a sensational scoop and exaggerate extreme remarks by some Chinese internet users or biased comments of the potential internet trolls or online water army. It is then generalized as being indicative of a wider Chinese stance to create confrontation while ignoring the repeated impartial voice of the Chinese government. Typical smears include China foresaw Russia's plan, China is the biggest beneficiary of the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, the island of Taiwan is the next Ukraine, or China wants to bring in women fleeing Ukraine. The US-led public opinion war is systematic, with elaborate strategies, and involves the participation of forces representing the interests of the military-industrial complex, politicians, or commercial organizations. Li Haidong, a professor from the Institute of International Relations at the China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, told the Global Times, those forces represented by the US media and politicians to play the game of public opinion have been good at hyping sensational events to blow the minds of the public and using inflammatory descriptions to bring the subjects they attack into a passive and helpless position amongst public opinion, the experts said. In the section Campaign Collusion by US Politicians and Media, citing anonymous officials and Western intelligence reports, various US media, including the New York Times, CNN, and the New York Post, hyped the allegations that China asked Russia to delay the invasion until after the Winter Olympics over the past few weeks, while ignoring the clear-cut refutation made by Liu Pengyu, spokesperson of the Chinese embassy in the US, in reply to the media claims. Now, Australia is mentioned a total of 3 times in this article. Once there, and once more in the following paragraph. Australian media, ABC, implied that China stands with Russia in the crisis by selectively citing comments by experts. In a Chinese language article ABC published on March the 7th, it quoted Australia-based political commentators and scholars as saying that China has never changed its pro-Russia stance and China gives secret support to Russia. Worse still, although China has openly stressed it opposes all actions that add fuel to the fire, readers found that some Indian and Western media describe China as a beneficiary of the Russia-Ukraine tensions by hyping the geopolitical or economic interests the tensions may bring to China. It's a pretty lengthy article, and the concluding paragraph of the article reads, Li Haidong said that many of the slanderous content of media outlets or private organizations are in fact from the government sources. For example, US government funds for global publicity flow to the media or public relations companies, so the public opinion war is a multi-department, multi-field, or even cross-border business right now. In the past decades, it was used to make the Soviet Union collapse. Now it's on China. The attack or the intention to attack China is obvious: to cooperate with their governments to launch the highest intensity strategic competition with China through slandering China in international community in order to weaken China's international influence. Based on this initial impression, I think it's fair to say that Australia is not constructed in a positive light, but rather one of a negative one. We'll move along to the next article. published on the 9th of March in the economy section of the Global Times by Wang Yi. This headline reads, India-Australia FTA talks shouldn't be led by anti-China paranoia. The opening paragraph of the article reads, free trade talks between Australia and India are reportedly getting close to reaching an interim deal, which is immediately described by some media as a tool to cut their reliance on China. The interim free trade agreement is expected to be clinched as early as this month, as both nations seek to cut their economic dependence on China, Nikkei reported on Wednesday. Negotiations between India and Australia to promote a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement dated back to as early as 2011. To conclude the marathon talks and reaching a deal did not come easy. To reach a full-fledged FTA, both sides still have a long way to go, and the narrative that the deal is to counter China is misplaced. There are obvious obstacles in India and Australia's FTA push. Voice of America, the VOA, claimed last August that while India is particularly concerned that its domestic agricultural sector could be overwhelmed after a FTA deal allows Australian agricultural products to enter the Indian market, and Australia is reluctant to issue less restrictive visas for Indian workers. Australia is mentioned a total of 15 times in the article. It appears again in this paragraph. Given such obstacles still exist, even as the two countries are approaching an interim deal, more efforts are needed in order to reach a final agreement. It takes courage for both India and Australia to resolve the differences that will impact vested interests. And in this paragraph, if the interim agreement can be smoothly concluded this month as reported, it will be a boost for Australia and India's coronavirus-hit economies. However, if it is hijacked by radical anti-China politicians to undermine their beneficial trade ties with China, those attempts will surely cause more pain for the people in the two countries. Although China, India, and China-Australia bilateral relations have encountered setbacks in recent years, the pair still enjoy mutually beneficial economic and trade relations. According to data from China's customs, bilateral trade between China and India surged 43.3% year-on-year, reaching $28.14 billion in 2021. China-Australia trade reached $164.82 billion, up 35.1% from last year. Australia continues to be mentioned in these following paragraphs. This data proves that political posturing will never help economic and trade cooperation, and it also demonstrates that China, the world's manufacturing hub and the largest market, is increasingly serving as a stabilizer for global trade in the past years. If anti-China politicians in Australia or India continue to push trade decoupling with the Chinese economy due to their anti-China paranoia, their people will suffer from their ill-willed decisions. The anti-China forces in Australia have been whining about being the victim of China's economic coercion, while serving as a pawn in the US's anti-China campaign at the expense of the Australian business community. However, their tricks to defraud domestic political interests are clear to the domestic business community and are no longer effective. With a national election due by May, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison's anti-China strategy has failed to improve his government's polling, according to Bloomberg. A closer look into the bilateral trade between China and India shows that past trade records have been surpassed despite protectionist or decoupling moves by India. Yet India's discriminatory restrictions have shaken the confidence of Chinese companies operating in the Indian market. There are no further mentions of Australia in this article, and based on what I've read so far, I'm inclined to believe that it is looking and feeling and reading like a negative construction of Australia. What are your thoughts? Is this article clearly negative, or is there more than meets the eye? We move along to the next article. Published on the 9th of March by Chen Hong. This is found in the Viewpoint section, and the headline reads, "A submissive Australia is in no position to criticize India's independent strategies on Ukraine crisis." So another article targeted specifically at Australia, and it's accompanied by an illustration by Liu Rui of a kangaroo holding on to a balloon, which is represented with the national flag wrapped around the balloon while turning towards the sun. Interesting. The opening paragraph of this article reads, "Some media outlets in Australia have been feverishly roused in recent weeks, stirring up discord during the ongoing military conflicts in Ukraine. They have been criticizing countries like India and Indonesia that have refused to follow the US-led West announcement of Russia and called to impose sanctions. Instead, they called for diplomacy and dialogue as solutions to the crisis." I've got to read that line again. That have refused to follow the US-led West announcement of Russia and called to impose sanctions. Instead, they called for diplomacy and dialogue as solutions to the crisis. As a member of the quadrilateral security dialogue, which has been pulled together and mobilized by the US as the axis of its treasured Indo-Pacific strategy, India is expected to synchronize and take its cues from Washington. Australia is mentioned here with a reference to Canberra being a loyal acolyte of Team USA. Now, this is a first. I've been keeping a close watch at articles from the Global Times, and such an expression, a loyal acolyte of Team USA, that is a first. Canberra has been a loyal acolyte of Team USA with constantly unfailing dedication. The former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull pledged to join at the hip with the US in defense and foreign affairs. His successor, Scott Morrison, boasted that there is no deeper friendship than that which exists between Australia and the US. We see the world through the same eyes. Indeed, Canberra has been supporting almost every initiative and strategy yielded from the White House for decades. It never missed out on a single war waged by the US at the cost of Australian lives and Australian taxpayers' money. For Canberra, it is unimaginable that developing countries demonstrate their maturity and independence and stand up against the West's political pressures. It is a universal truism that all sovereign countries are politically independent with their own national interests to protect and promote. They have the unchallengeable right to make decisions and formulate their own international policy. Australia is mentioned a number of times in the article, 15 times in total. Australia is mentioned here. There is something important for Australia to consider. Why is India making its own diplomatic decisions on an important international issue like the Ukraine crisis, while Australia continues to pledge its allegiance to Washington at the cost of its own national interest? In psychology, there is a neurotic syndrome called fear of missing out, or FOMO, which often brings about stress and anxiety because the victim is always in apprehension of being unable to possess or achieve something good. Some people in Australia apparently need a psychiatrist's couch as they are constantly worried they will be left behind by Washington. They pathetically believe that Australia should attach itself to the US hegemony to attain security, just as creeping vines have to coil around a sturdy tree trunk. I think that deserves a reread. Some people in Australia apparently need a psychiatrist's couch as they're constantly worried that they'll be left behind by Washington. They pathetically believe, a pretty strong choice of words, pathetically believe that Australia should attach itself to the US hegemony to attain security, and it is further accentuated or attenuated with kind of like a figure of speech expression, just as creeping vines have to coil around a sturdy tree trunk with a kind of a meta message embedded. Interesting choice of words. It still remains uncertain whether Canberra will attain true independence or remain immature in a perpetual cocoon. The author is president of the Chinese Association of Australian Studies and director of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University. Now, based on this impression, I think it's pretty clear Australia is represented and constructed in a negative light. Not only negative, but clearly repulsive. I guess lending further weight, there is indeed an othering offensive taking place. We'll move along to the next article. Originally published by Reuters, March the 9th, 2022, 6:29 p.m. In the World Asia Pacific section, the headline reads, PM to declare national emergency, with the subheader, Australia's worst hit flood areas to receive aid and supplies. The article is accompanied with a photograph, and the photograph has the following captions. A woman kayaks with her dog to move around her flooded neighbourhood in the Windsor suburb of Sydney, Australia, on March the 9th, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, floods that have devastated Australia's east coast will be declared a national emergency, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said on Wednesday, as authorities look to deploy aid and urgent supplies to the worst hit areas. Morrison, on a visit to the devastated town of Lismore in New South Wales, also pledged more financial support for people and businesses affected by weeks of rain that have submerged rural towns and suburbs across Sydney. The emergency declaration, which was set up after Australia's destructive 2019 bushfires, will help cut red tape and speed up aid from defence personnel amid criticism about a slow response to the floods, in which 20 people have died. Australia is mentioned a total of 6 times in the article. And where I think the article goes beyond taking a neutral position is a little signal towards Scott Morrison's character in the following 2 paragraphs. Morrison's Conservative government in late 2021 adopted a net zero carbon emissions target by 2050, but climate activists are demanding more aggressive action. In 2020, Morrison was criticized for taking a family holiday in Hawaii during the fire emergency and was later heckled by angry residents of a bushfire-hit town over fire service funding and a lack of assistance. A large swath of Australia's east coast has been inundated after a second intense low-pressure system in its many weeks led to fast-rising floodwaters that cut off entire communities and trapped many people in their homes. Based on this initial impression, I was leaning towards placing this as a neutral construction, but for that paragraph, I think I'll make a note that this article is probably a little bit more than meets the eye. Certainly some subtext to be decoded over here. With that in mind, we'll move along to the next article. Originally published by Xinhua, March the 9th, 2022 at 11:08 a.m. This is a photo story with the headline, Deadly Floods Continue to Batter Australia's East. There are a number of photographs, and the first photograph has the following captions. People stack baskets for flood control in Willoughby, New South Wales, Australia on March the 8th, 2022. Flash floods, wild winds and storms are continuing to lash Australia's east coast, causing hundreds of people to flee their ruined homes and killing at least 13 people in the state of Queensland and 7 in New South Wales. Further images of the devastation and destruction in New South Wales, such as this one of a flooded property. The photo story is accompanied with a number of paragraphs, and the opening paragraph reads, "Flash floods, wild winds and storms are continuing to lash Australia's east coast, causing hundreds of people to flee their ruined homes and killing at least 13 people in the state of Queensland and 7 in New South Wales, NSW. Australia is mentioned 11 times in the article, appearing a number of times in the captions, and further once in the written paragraphs. Based on this impression, I think Australia is represented and constructed in a neutral manner. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 10th of March, with the headline, "Australia's military buildup controlled by US risks nuclear contamination." This is written by Leng Shumei, March the 10th, 2022 at 10:23 p.m. and found in the China military section of the Global Times. The article is accompanied with a photograph of Scott Morrison, and its opening paragraph reads, "Australia announced its second major military plan within a week as Prime Minister Scott Morrison said Thursday that the country would make its biggest military expansion in 4 decades. However, Chinese experts said the latest move, together with a plan to build a new base for its future nuclear-powered submarines announced 3 days ago, is clearly a loss-making business for Australia, as it is spending money only to make a US-led military deployment base closer to China." The article is clearly directed towards Australia, and Australia is mentioned a total of 15 times in the piece. Let's continue unpacking this one. Morrison said that Australian Defence Force personnel will expand to more than 101,000, an increase of about 30% by 2040, costing some $38 billion, Australian media reported. Now that's a pretty significant increase if I recall my numbers correctly. The current size of the ADF is approximately 60-ish million, so that's going to bring it up to 101,000. Morrison also said that the ADF's personnel will be increased in every state and territory. There will be a particular focus on capabilities associated with Australia's security partnership with the UK and the US, AUKUS, and in the air, at sea, on land, in space, and in cyberspace, media reported. A large component of the new personnel, estimated at about 6,000 people, will be for the development of the nuclear-powered submarine capability, Morrison announced on Monday, citing so-called increasing threats from China and Russia. Let's take a closer look at the mentions of Australia. It appears here with the paragraph reading, "Some Australian senior officials have been making negative comments concerning China, advocating the so-called China threat and confrontation with China in the South China Sea out of their personal interests." Further on, we urge certain senior military and political officials of Australia to stop hyping the China threat and do more to enhance mutual trust between the two sides. The next paragraph goes on to say, Chinese experts said that the latest moves indicate that Australia is determined to act as an accomplice of the US's global hegemony and intervention in regional affairs and follow the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy to contain China. Australia lacks the capacity to design and build submarines, so the nuclear-powered submarine force Australia aimed to build wound out to be a squadron of the US and would practically be controlled by the US in terms of not only the technology, but also command. Song Zhongping, a Chinese military commentator, told the Global Times on Thursday. Once finished, Australia's nuclear-powered submarine base will allow nuclear-powered submarines from the US and the UK to visit the West Pacific and the South China Sea more often, which would pose a more direct threat to China. But the base would still be within the reach of China's missiles, so the survivability of the base is also in doubt. Experts also noted it will take years for Australia to construct the base, during which period China would continue to develop its maritime defense capabilities so as to cope with possible external threats. The concluding paragraph of this article reads, "Located in Oceania, Australia could have been a land of peace, but it insists on being a pawn for the US to contain China. This is unwise and would lift a rock only to drop it on its own feet," Song said. From this initial impression, I think it's a pretty clear negative and repulsive construction. And with that, we'll move along to the next article for the week. Published on the 10th of March, this is a photo story. It has the headline, "Greeting the Child" by VCG. This is found in the World section of the Global Times. The photograph has the following captions. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison in the center is seen greeting Alejandra Tuton, left aged 2, while inspecting flood damage at the Brisbane basketball court in a suburb in Brisbane, Australia on March the 10th, 2022. Morrison is expected to make a formal request for a national emergency with the Queensland Premier after devastating floods ravaged southeastern parts of the state. Based on this initial impression, I'm kind of led to think this is a neutral, perhaps even somewhat positive construction of Australia. Because if one were to unpack the photo, you can see the Australian PM squatting down to get on the same level as the kid to give the kid a high five, but in the background, accompanied by security staff, which is making me think of all the pictures to choose. Why choose this one when it's clearly staged? And when we look at this article in relation to the rest of the coverage that's been coming through for the week, certainly more to unpack with this one, Greeting the Child. We'll move along to the next article. And this is published on the 10th of March, originally by Xinhua, with the headline, Enlightened Festival runs in Canberra, Australia. It looks like it's a bunch of photo stories, and we'll have a look at the first set of captions. Photo taken on March the 9th, 2022 shows the illuminated giant bubbles displayed in front of the Canberra Theatre Centre during the Enlightened Festival in Canberra, Australia. The annual Enlightened Festival runs this month with landmark buildings illuminated with colourful lights. There's a second photograph with the same bunch of captions. You got a third photograph with giant bubbles displayed in front of the Canberra Theatre Centre. And a final photograph of the giant bubbles in front of the Theatre Centre. Based on this initial impression, I think Australia is represented in the case of this piece, somewhat positive manner. Let's keep moving along to the final article for the week, published on the 11th of March, with the headline, New Zealand tourism recovery faces great challenges and amid phased border reopening. It comes with a number of photographs, the first of which has the following captions. Photo taken on January 11th, 2022 shows a view of Banks Peninsula, where the town of Akaroa is located in New Zealand. There are a number of other accompanying photographs, and the opening paragraph of this article reads, after nearly a decade, after nearly 2 years border closure, the year of 2022 is the reopening of the tourism industry in New Zealand, as the government signaled, but it will still be a bumpy road ahead, the head of tourism in New Zealand told Xinhua on Thursday. Australia is mentioned once in the article in the section Eyes on China. The paragraph reads, before 2020, when the pandemic hit the country, New Zealand is a popular destination for global tourists, with Australia, China and the United States being the top 3 international markets for the country's tourism sector. Based on this initial impression, I think Australia is represented and constructed in a neutral manner. And with that said, this concludes our look at the articles from the Global Times for the week. And to once again quickly recap the headlines: New Zealand tourism recovery faces great challenges amid phased border reopening. Enlightened Festival runs in Canberra, Australia. Greeting the Child. Australia's military buildup controlled by the US. Risks nuclear contamination. Deadly floods continue to batter Australia's east. PM to declare national emergency. A submissive Australia is in no position to criticize India's independent strategies on Ukraine crisis. India-Australia FTA talks shouldn't be led by anti-China paranoia. The forces behind the fiction, the misinformation that China supports Russia's military action. And Australian e-commerce body calls for re-engagement with China to achieve win-win results. The final 3 articles for the week had the following headlines: tough 24 hours ahead as rains drench Sydney, forcing snap evacuations. Aussie researcher warns of deadly risk of novel flu viruses. And lastly, Morrison tries to leverage Australia's influence in IndoPacific region with Cold War-style rhetoric. We'll move along to take a closer look at Sky News Australia. There were 5 articles relating to China for the week. And the first one we'll have a look at comes with the following headline: no country will have a bigger impact on ending Russia-Ukraine war than China. The article is accompanied with a video, 3 minutes and 4 seconds in length. The opening lines of this article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says, no country will have a bigger impact than China on ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. China has long claimed to play a role as one of the major powers in the world and to be a contributor to global peace and stability, Mr. Morrison said. This is why I reinforced this point that no country will have a bigger impact on concluding this terrible war in Ukraine than China. So long as they had a bet each way on this, then I fear the bloodshed will continue. Based on this initial impression, I would think that pretty much this could be a negative construction based on the following line. So long as they had a bet each way on this, then I fear the bloodshed will continue. We'll move along to the next article. Found in the politics section of Sky News Australia. This article has the following headline: Scott Morrison condemns China's ongoing support of Russia, demands Beijing denounce Russia's war in Ukraine. The subheader: Scott Morrison has again demanded China stop its support of Russia and its catastrophic war in Ukraine, accusing Beijing of having a bet each way. Written by Tyrone Clark, March the 7th, 2022 at 4:05 p.m. The article already has garnered 31 comments, and this is something I've been thinking about. There's typically a fair amount of comments found and accompanying many of these articles in Sky News Australia, and in contrast, in the Global Times, there isn't even a platform for comments to be added. So something I'll be thinking about maybe as I approach the next episode, perhaps taking a closer look at comments, because this would be the result of the discursive practice. In any case, something I'll revisit at a later stage, but for now, let's continue to unpack this article. The article is accompanied with a video 3 minutes and 4 seconds in length, entitled "No country will have a bigger impact on ending Russia-Ukraine war than China." The opening lines of this paragraph of this article reads, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has warned that the bloodshed will continue in Ukraine if China does not join the West in cutting out Russia. The Prime Minister has again made another public plea to the leadership in Beijing to use its strength to put an end to Russia's invasion in Ukraine. However, in an address to the Lowy Institute on Monday, Mr. Morrison accused China of posturing and not acting on issues of global peace and respect for sovereignty. The world has heard China's words about its commitments to global peace and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, Mr. Morrison said. It's now up to China and its leaders at this point in history to demonstrate that these are more than just words. But I fear the early signs are not good. Mr. Morrison pointed to China's recent decision to ease trade restrictions on Russian wheat, as well as reports of offering support after Moscow was cut out of the SWIFT payments system. China was also reportedly advised of President Vladimir Putin's desire to invade Ukraine, but requested it be held off until the conclusion of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which Mr. Morrison described as quite chilling. He then went on to call on China to level sanctions on Russia. No country would have a greater impact right now on Russia's violent aggression towards Ukraine than China, joining the rest of the world in denouncing Russia's aggression and applying the same sanctions that we have. The crisis that is in Europe heralds a choice for China's government and leadership. Mr. Morrison touted his government's defense spending and procurement, arguing he was rapidly boosting arms capabilities to keep Australia safe. In his speech, Mr. Morrison also revealed his government's plan to build a $10 billion submarine base on the East Coast as he warns of a new threat to global security. China is mentioned.
Dave, good morning to you. So what sort of a strategic
Apologies for that. China is mentioned numerous times through the article. And it concludes with a look at the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, accusing the Prime Minister of making an announcement about an announcement. So the article is shifting in tone and messaging in its later half, but in the opening paragraphs, clearly a case of constructing China in a negative light, and the way it's attempting to rile up China by questioning its commitments to global peace, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, leads me to think that this is perhaps a clear example of the othering offensive taking place. We'll keep moving along to the next article. This is published on the 8th of March with the following headline: Mining billionaire Gina Rinehart fears Australia becoming inactive in China relationship, urges more defense spending. This is found in the Australia News Politics section of Sky News Australia. The subheader reads, Gina Rinehart fears Australia has become inactive in its relationship with China and called for far greater defense spending in an exclusive interview with Sky News Australia. The article is accompanied with a 10-minute and 36-second long video entitled "Australia Desperately Needs Self-Sufficiency." The opening lines of this article reads, "Billionaire mining magnate Gina Rinehart has warned Australia needs to desperately boost military funding and reduce red tape to make the country more self-sufficient." In a rare interview with Sky News host Andrew Bolt, Ms. Rinehart shares her thoughts on worsening diplomatic tensions with China, the impact of feeble Russian sanctions, and the need to bolster Australia's defense industries. "We need sufficiency in medicines, we need self-sufficiency in defense materials. We desperately need, in my view, a refocus on our federal budgets to include more for defense." China is mentioned a number of times in this article, 10 times all up. And it's mentioned here. And this paragraph reads, "China is led by terribly intelligent people and they see things at a further distance and more in the future than what we do," she said. "Australia is not the only country where there is iron ore and coal, and they, meaning China, are going all over the world to open up not only more iron ore and coal mines, but rare earths. And we have been inactive in relation to these very critical matters." The concluding paragraphs of this article reads, Ms. Rinehart said the government needs to be more concerned. The government needed to be concerned about China developing massive coal deposits in Africa as it threatened Australian markets. Australia should be very mindful of this. We really need to depend on our mining industry, and if a lot of the markets were closed, we would be a different country. We need our mining industry for defense, for our police, for emergency services, our kindergartens, our hospitals and healthcare, you name it. We really are dependent on our mining industry. Based on this impression, I think that this article has two messages. First, the need to boost defense spending, and the other, a message about interdependence between the Australian and Chinese markets, and Ms. Rinehart highlighting the threat to Australia's well-being if China shifts its attention to Africa for coal. We'll move along to the next article. And this is the final one for the week. It comes with the headline, "China sends warning to West over sanctions regime as Beijing throws more support behind Russian propaganda on Ukraine war." The subheader, "China sends a pointed message to the West to stay out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as Beijing echoes Moscow's radical propaganda lines." Written by Tyrone Clark, March 11th, 2022 at 11:40 a.m. The article is accompanied by a video, 4 minutes and 51 seconds in length, with the title, "Beijing Reiterates Claim NATO Instigated Conflict." The opening lines of this article read, "China's foreign ministry has warned the West that more sanctions on Russia will create new problems as the state media throws more support behind Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. As the United States, the EU, Australia and countries across the world continue to level severe sanctions on Russia's elite and its major institutions, China has moved to support its ally in Moscow." Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian hit out at Western retaliatory measures and said wielding the big sticks of sanctions would not solve the war in Ukraine. "It has long been proven that rather than addressing the problem, sanctions will create new problems," he said during his daily press briefing on Thursday. The US should not impose so-called sanctions and long-armed jurisdiction on Chinese companies and individuals or undermine the legitimate rights and interests of China. Otherwise, China will make strong and resolute response. It comes as Chinese state TV, which dominates the airwaves and on social media across the country, repeats Russian propaganda lines. A report by CNN found Chinese media was describing the conflict as a special military operation, the same explanation offered by Mr. Putin when he announced the invasion more than 15 days ago. Russia's disinformation campaign has included claims of US biological weapons activity in Ukraine, the justification of the war as liberating and denazifying Ukraine's, and allegations of attacks on Russian natives in the now war-torn country. The report found Chinese government-controlled TV had repeatedly spread these talking points.
Thank you very much, Pam. Thank you.
Web of state-run social media. Zhao Lijian also hit back at questioning over China's repeated use of Russian-sanctioned propaganda lines, saying it was irresponsible to dismiss the claims as disinformation. It comes as the United States warns of Russia's chemical weapons stockpile and the potential threat of it using them on civilians. They have large biological and chemical weapons programs, so it's a concern, but they also have the capacity, the White House press secretary said on Thursday. There are further mentions of China in the following tweet. Now that Russia has made these false claims, and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use the chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. Based on this initial impression, I think it's pretty clear that China is constructed in a negative manner. Some of the comments that have come in from Hazy. It suddenly does feel like the world is getting out of control. I've always felt that there's something disconcerting about the idea that in order to maintain a way of life that is so valued in a free world, we have made ourselves dependent on trades with nations that do not share these values. You see animal activists arguing that a product isn't truly cruelty-free if it traded to a nation that then later tests that product on animals, and yet you never see too many people saying that sneakers are not really pro-democracy because they're manufactured by people in a communist country. Pure observation. On a side note, I'm very thankful to Sky News. As a Canadian, this is where I come, and when I want to be sure that the news I'm watching is accurate and truthful. Another comment that's come in from Rodney. Very admirable that Dutton wants to increase Australia's military capabilities, but the Never Never plan won't do against the might of China. We need a creditable deterrence, and we need it now. You only have to look at the West's inactions in Ukraine to realize that Australia cannot rest easy with our defense. By Bob. Bless the souls of those who still believe that they're what the Western government and media tell them to believe. With a reply sounding Chinese to me. Australia disengaged from everything Chinese. It's showtime. And what's your plan regarding the devastating impact it will have on our already fragile economy? I abhor war, but at what point do we stop shooting from the hip? Another comment. This is far from World War III. Well, if we continue to give in to the likes of Xi Jinping and Putin, we won't be far from it. It's because the West, in particular America's weak need response and passive stance that has enabled or emboldened the likes of Putin and Xi Jinping. The next country to watch will be Taiwan. The author with a spelling error over there. The CCP has already just walked in and taken Hong Kong with violence and intimidation, with virtually no response from the Western democratic countries. What happened to the nation of Hong Kong should not have happened. Certainly very, very contentious line written over here. But as I'm going through all of these comments, it's really encouraging me to integrate these into my watch, into my observations. Beyond simply documenting and dictating the articles themselves, taking a closer look at the result of the articles, the kind of discourse that it generates, is certainly worth documenting too. Something I'll be doing more actively in the next episode. But for now, this concludes our look at articles from Sky News Australia with relation to China for the week. To recap the headlines, no country with a bigger impact on ending Russia-Ukraine war than China. PM demands China denounce Russia or risk further bloodshed. Australia's richest person calls for desperate boost to military funding. China's chilling warning to West over Russia's war in Ukraine. And finally, Australia hits out at China over propaganda lies. Thank you so much for your continued support of the Australia China Media Watch podcast. This concludes our look at the news articles from the 7th of March, Monday, running through to Sunday, the 13th of March, 2022. This is the Australia China Media Watch podcast, signing off for the week. Goodbye.